I'm gonna say this up front. There's a lot to love in Bioshock Infinite. The game is one of the most jaw-droppingly gorgeous games in recent memory, thanks mostly to some deft art direction. It evokes a turn-of-the-century charm with an almost Norman Rockwell sense of idealism. And the visuals are steeped in a three-pronged soundtrack that has original scores, licensed period music, and old-timey covers of pop songs from the last 50 years. It's hard not to be moved at some point during the game, either by jaw-droppingly gorgeous vistas or cleverly rearranged covers of a song. To top that off, there are moments of real, genuine human empathy here. Elizabeth and Booker's song in the basement of the shantytown bar is obviously a highlight of the game, but there are smaller moments. Hearing how Preston Downs moves from Comstock's pocket to a member of the Resistance, a Titanic-style scene where a woman is sobbing that she can't make the jump to the lifeboat, Booker's sudden panic and rejection of his baptism. These are emotionally charged scenes that feel like real things that real people would do. They're effective, grounded, honest. They give the game a much-needed sense of humanity because so much of the game is, well, this.
Stop him! Stop him! The false shepherd has to lead our lamb astray!
Which wouldn't be out of place in most games, but Bioshock Infinite doesn't want to be most games. It wants to be important, it wants to say something, but it thinks it can do that without addressing its absurd, stilted, floaty, gory gameplay, and more than anything, that's why it fails. Sure, we could wax philosophical about the game's ending, but that's 20 minutes of barely interactive play made memorable by a plot twist. And while it is neat, and it does have some of the best moments of the game, it doesn't justify the 7 hours that came before it any more than making people watch a good Twilight Zone episode can justify making them watch 7 hours of homemade snuff films. About a fifth of the game seems to stem from a place that at least has ambitions of being artful, of saying something that connects with people. But the remaining 80% is gunshots, explosions, and magical space booze that gives you colorful superpowers as you slaughter racist religious zealots in a city in the sky with your nine-fingered companion who can take you to alternate dimensions. Do you see how that might conflict with the grounded emotions and empathetic truths a little bit? One fundamentally opposes the other, and you can't have both. It's not even that the game suffers from some severe dissonance between its play and its story, although that's certainly here. Booker will be mourning his time as a Pinkerton agent keeping the unions down or lamenting his involvement in Wounded Knee one minute, and the next he's exploding the heads off of one person or jamming his skyhook straight into the neck of another. But more than just dissonant, the combat feels like empty, pointless filler designed to pad a game out to official retail game length TM. The violence is never at any point sufficiently justified. In Bioshock, splicers felt like monsters, but in a way they actually were. They were certainly no longer human and were driven mad either by their genetic modifications, living in a tin can at the bottom of the sea, or simply witnessing the horrors of Rapture's fall. Here, though, there's no justification for why everyday townsfolk will bum-rush Booker with a suicidal fervor and insatiable bloodlust. Rapture felt like a place where Atom addicts were stalking you for their next fix. Bioshock Infinite feels like a game that puts enemies in your way because it's a video game, and that's what video games do. The handyman fights are a great example of this. They're Bioshock Infinite's equivalent of Big Daddies. It's even implied that they're based on Fink overhearing Shu Chong and Tenenbaum's research. In Bioshock, Big Daddies would roam the halls and warn you away if you got too close, but you had to actively transgress to start combat. These fights were, at least until the end of the game, major events that had you gather resources and plan for them. But when you were ready, you could attempt to slay one of these huge beasts, and when you killed him, he'd let out a tortured moan as his little sister would sob over the body. What happened to her then was up to you. Big Daddy fights had a sense of anticipation and player preparation leading up to them that climaxed in this combination of victory tinged with a bit of sadness. In Bioshock Infinite, handyman attacks are just scripted events that come whenever the designers think they'd look the coolest. A big guy in a metal suit shows up and wails on you like he's a stock mini-boss out of Double Dragon. There's no tension, just a war of attrition as you try to whittle his health down before moving on, indifferent to the whole affair. These monsters don't have a meaningful place in the world the way the Big Daddies did. Your fights with them don't have any emotional stakes the way your fights with Big Daddies did. The result just feels hollow and clumsy in comparison. They're just a particularly frustrating generic bad guy that prevents you from getting to another quiet conversation with Elizabeth or a small moment with a Colombian citizen. And that's to say nothing of the infinite spawning Ghost Mom boss, or the protect the generator level, or the giant scripted airship takedown, or the transparently scripted chase sequence leading up to Comstock's ship. In a very palpable way, Bioshock Infinite is far more contrived, gamey, and artificial than Bioshock ever was. And that goes for the environmental design too. The entire game feels less like a trip to a city in the clouds and more like a trip to Walt Disney World. No small part of this is due to all of the turn-of-the-century Americana, but the sense of artificiality goes quite deeper than that. The entire game is suffocatingly linear, and you'll find yourself wondering why a city of free-floating islands has only one path in and out of any given area, and whether men, women, and children all use skyhooks to get around. There are plenty of doors to nowhere and environmental design meant to funnel you down the intended path. Giant signs label Shantytown and the Factory and the Hall of Heroes to announce that you're entering a differently themed area, the way signs might point out how you're entering Frontierland or Tomorrowland at Disney. You'll see crowded beaches and city streets one moment, and as soon as combat begins, they're curiously empty, as though Columbia also has the ability to transform itself into a gladiatorial arena at a moment's notice. The experience is one of playing a first-person shooter themed after the Magic Kingdom's Main Street USA. It's a gorgeous, lovingly crafted homage to turn-of-the-century small-town America, but it's also very obviously a scaled-down facade, and instead of emptying out for a parade, it empties out so you can throw fire grenades at people. Columbia may be beautiful, but it also feels hollow and artificial. But while the emotional tone of the game may be lacking and the setting of Columbia may be flawed, it's the gameplay that ultimately tipped the scales against Bioshock Infinite for me. At this point, just about the entire soul of the game's legacy has been stripped away. You can play System Shock 2, Bioshock, and Bioshock 2, and chart how their Ultima Underworld influence is lessened as they've become more and more a stock shooter with every iteration. With Bioshock Infinite, that transformation is more or less complete. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, Human Revolution simplified or removed a lot of Deus Ex's mechanics, but it still felt true to the series, yet modern. But the mechanics they've settled on haven't transformed the game into a streamlined version of itself. Arguably, that's what the first Bioshock did when it modernized System Shock 2. Instead, they've taken a game franchise that has been traditionally about resource management and planning with an action twist, and boiled it completely down to a stock shooter. What little inventory management Bioshock had left is gone. Crafting is gone. Hacking is gone. Security systems are functionally gone and replaced with boring turrets and guns that attack on sight. Bioshock had 3 independent systems you could play against each other, like having a turret hit a Big Daddy to make him fight it, or throwing Enrage at a Big Daddy to kill splicers. None of that is here. The photography research minigame is completely absent. Combat research and hacking tonics have been replaced with a nonsensical clothing system where, depending on what kind of hat or vest you wear, your skyhook can set people on fire or give you health from kills. You no longer have multiple ammunition types for each weapon. Weapon upgrades are still here, but they've made the entire system broken and pointless by doubling the weapon count and then letting you only pick up at most 2 weapons at a time. This means you might spend $1,000 upgrading a pistol that you might drop when you realize 2 other weapons are situationally more advantageous right now, but the only way you can get that upgraded pistol back is to find another one laying about in the world levels later. Exploration is all but dead. Bioshock had plenty of nooks and crannies and back alleys to rifle through. Infinite occasionally gives you a closet. But more than the lack of spaces to explore, there's just not all that much to find. Bioshock had health kits and Eve hypos to hoard, one-use weapon upgrade stations, tonics, crafting supplies, auto-hack tools, and more. Infinite has boiled everything down to 2 core resources you can carry: money and lockpicks. Even the number of audio logs are cut in half from Bioshock, and there just really is no incentive to poke around the already linear, simplified levels. God, and this is just the stuff that's been removed. We haven't even gotten to how it actually plays yet. And, well, look, the combat in the Shock series has always been sort of bad, but that's okay, because it's always been backed by more interesting systems than how the guns feel in your hand. System Shock 1 and 2 were very much about resource management and rig building, and Bioshock tried to get you to play different factions of Rapture off of one another with traps and security hacks and plasmids. The fact that the gunplay was loose and flaccid never really mattered because that wasn't what the game was ever about at its core. But here, shooting is all that's left, yet it still feels like you're firing Nerf guns and pea shooters at unflinching bullet sponges. The core gunplay was one of the original Bioshock's biggest criticisms, and it has not been improved here despite the increased focus. Remember how Bioshock's plasmids had 3 types of elemental damage, various plasmids to get the enemies to play off of one another, bees and decoys for crowd control, and cyclones to let you set traps? Pretty much all vigors boil down to some combination of crowd control, direct damage, and trap, which means each vigor is effectively interchangeable. Each can be quite powerful, but that's the problem. Spamming Bucking Bronco as a crowd control and damage amplifier isn't all that different than spamming Murder of Crows as a crowd control and damage amplifier. This doesn't take what Bioshock did and move it forward, it takes it way, way back. About the only vigor that has any unique utility is tossing people off of Columbia with Undertow. And if I'm being honest, it's too little too late after Dishonored's gust of wind power. That game was only 5 months ago, and it did the magical powers and gunplay things so much better than this. You get a sense of controlling your environment, of planning your attacks, of having powers that genuinely have utility and play off of one another. Freezing time to set up multiple arrow shots in one instant, or tricking guards to run into a spring wire trap. I said in my Dishonored video that it created a ludic language to let players express themselves in, and if that's true, then Bioshock Infinite is a toddler's illegible scribblings. It's not a series of systems to let you plan and execute brilliant moves by combining useful powers in interesting ways. It's simply a bedlam of spamming your favorite vigor in whatever two guns you happen to have. Quite frankly, it plays like a generic, derivative, unfinished, compromised mess, and I'm astounded that people can spend 7 hours shooting the same 4 enemy types with the same generic, ineffectual guns and utterly uncreative plasmids, and then hail the game a triumph. I've mentioned this before, but the modern shooter has a problem with health mechanics. Way back in the days of Doom, getting hurt was a sign that the player screwed up. Most of Doom's damage was dealt with avoidable projectiles or melee hits from monsters themselves. Completing a level was an act of balancing the amount you screwed up with the amount of spare health kits in the level, and easier levels and easier difficulties had more health kits. As the genre's matured, though, we've moved away from projectile avoidance towards systems where most enemies have hitscan weapons that instantly go from the enemies to the player. This is ostensibly due to the trend away from magical imps with fireballs and towards more realistic weapons like machine guns and pistols. This represents a problem for the player, though. Now that you can't avoid bullets, you will get hit. It's not a sign that you've screwed up, it's an inevitability of moving around when there's an enemy nearby with instant hit guns. So designers have taken to addressing this in a lot of different ways. Halo's approach was pretty successful. Players have strong shields that, when finally broken, cut away at core health, and only then are they in trouble. A few stray bullets hitting your shield doesn't mean anything permanent or dangerous. This allows you to move about and position yourself before attacking without constantly resource monitoring your health. Dishonored had long, telegraphed animations to let you know when bullets were coming to give you a chance of teleporting out of the way or using health kits. Call of Duty has a full-on health regen system where players can get hit as much as they wanted as long as they hunkered down and took cover before reaching absolutely zero health. And Gears of War combines that with a cover system that lets you avoid most fire and control when you're exposed. Finally, the original Bioshock continued the tradition set forth in System Shock 2. Death isn't permanent and simply costs resources. Meanwhile, you can carry health kits to help you stave off death, but they're rare and also cost resources, so you need to use them wisely. So with this myriad of combat options available as precedent, and arguably plenty more mechanics waiting to be discovered, I'm aghast as to why Irrational chose an incredibly awkward merger of Halo shields, Doom item pickups, and a dice roll. They've adopted Halo's shield system, but part of what made that so successful was, again, that it was a strong shield, so that you had to screw up pretty bad to start taking damage against core health. Here, in order to balance and feed their upgrade system, it starts as a tiny sliver of overall health, making it effectively worthless until it's been substantially upgraded. And unlike the rest of the Shock series, you can't carry health kits with you anymore. You have to scavenge for them in the middle of combat as you need them, just like in Doom. Except that works far better in Doom because, well, A, you can avoid most damage as they're projectiles instead of hitscan weapons, and B, you just walk right over the health and ammo to pick them up. In Bioshock Infinite, you actually have to look right at them and then hit a use key to pick them up. The result is that combat in Bioshock Infinite has players running around trying to scavenge resources in the middle of battle from bodies and drawers while getting hit with damage they can't meaningfully avoid. These look at something and interact with it to pick it up mechanics have their roots as far back as System Shock and Ultima Underworld, but they have no purpose being mechanics you'd want players to absolutely rely on in the middle of combat. Ultimately, I found myself running out of health and not being sure I could survive the run to the closest health pickup because hitscan weapons would tear through my mediocre shield and kill me, and even if I got to the health kit, I'd have to scramble to align my mouse cursor with the thing and hit the use key. And in the middle of all of that, they throw Elizabeth. I've played through the game twice, and it's still not exactly clear to me whether she tosses the player actual items that could otherwise be picked up in the game, or if she just randomly generates health ammo and salts all on her own. Either way, though, the impact of the player is the same. In place of a reliable pool of health kits or salts like in Bioshock, you'll randomly get thrown a lifeline by your companion. And I get why they did it. It's an attempt to develop a relationship between Elizabeth and the player, and it's actually rather effective when she manages to give you what you need right as you need it. They took away your health and salt inventories because they needed to make you dependent on her in order to make her feel like a legitimate partner instead of a burden. I get it. But it also means that when you're under fire with a sliver of health left and no idea which way to run, you're entirely reliant on a random number generator to save you. And that sense of player disenfranchisement is really bothersome for a game that's undeniably trying to be more combat focused and less interested in quirky mechanical twists about emotions. It's especially annoying because there had to be ways of setting up this sense of dependence on Elizabeth that were less reliant on Booker shooting people in the face and hoping she throws him a health kit, and more reliant on Booker being dependent on Elizabeth's superpowers. Entire games can and have been made using universe-switching mechanics. It dovetails nicely into the game's story and makes Elizabeth even more cool and powerful. It could open up puzzles or stealth mechanics that might give the game some desperately needed mechanical variety, but instead we have this giant and monotonous murder fest with poorly designed and sloppy-feeling derivative mechanics trying to pass itself off as meaningful because of a 20-minute ending cutscene and... As long as we're on the subject of meaning, the game makes the same mistake that Bioshock did. It thinks that by presenting an idea, it's commenting on or engaging with that idea. It's sort of like saying that Errant Signal is a show about brackets because the damn things show up in every episode. Despite often referencing it, Bioshock had little to nothing to meaningfully say about objectivism. It was window dressing for the shooting and the big twist. And the pattern repeats here. Concepts of American exceptionalism, racial segregation, economic inequity, religious zealotry, and more don't really get discussed so much as simply displayed. Oh, their iconography is brought up plenty, but it's mostly just to use it as a plot beat. And in a way that makes it all the worse. The game takes something as big and complex and serious as institutionalized racism, and instead of talking about its root causes or its human costs or the struggle to change hearts and minds and laws, it basically just uses it as a shorthand for, "These white folks sure are evil." If the game attempts to take any political opinion at all, it's a milquetoast centrism that borders on nihilism by making both sides of the Colombian Revolution morally repugnant.
When it comes down to it, the only difference between Comstock and Fitzroy is how you spell it.
But even to do that, the game tries to make some rather creepy false equivalencies between setting up a systemically racist government that persecutes other religions and being an overzealous revolutionary that takes things a little too far. It rings false and is honestly a little emotionally manipulative, placing the life of a child right in front of you in direct comparison to the myriad of abstract, unseen crimes and suffering at the hands of Comstock. The result is a game that embarrasses itself in its attempts to offend no one, asking only that you find a political position somewhere left of racist dictator and somewhere right of murderous revolutionary. And none of that matters anyway, as it drops what little political pretext it has in the rush to get to the exposition necessary for the ending. The ending. I'm not going to go through the trouble of trying to work out what happened. There are plenty of videos and forum posts where the actual logistics are being torn apart. What confuses me about the ending isn't literally what happened, but what those events are supposed to mean, what we're supposed to take away from them, if anything. I've got my theories, none of which are particularly flattering to the game, but this video's run too long already. I'll close by saying this. As much as I hated, and I mean really detested, Bioshock Infinite's core gameplay, I kept playing because of those flashes of humanity. What propelled me forward wasn't fat loot or awesome headshots or flashy set pieces of explosions. It was seeing a sad monster horrified of what he'd become. It was awkward conversations with Elizabeth getting defensive about her finger. It was a father screaming out in defense of his child. It was a girl experiencing freedom and dance for once in her life. These are moments I legitimately loved in this game, moments that will stick with me. But we can't let games be human and artful in bits and pieces. Honesty and integrity and empathy aren't like marshmallows and Lucky Charms. They're not meant to be the small good parts surrounded by the fluff of machine gun fire and murder. And they're not like the lollipop we get for being a good kid at the dentist. They're not the sweet reward we get at the end for putting up with all this tacky combat. They're things we need to be demanding our games simply be. Sneaking in a quiet moment or saccharine song between meaningless violence isn't going to push this medium forward, and no number of 10 out of 10 reviews is going to change that. Bioshock Infinite's ambitions to be an affecting game aren't core to its experience. They aren't core to its gameplay. Instead, we simply glimpse them between the cracks of the edifice, the way the Fink brothers overheard brilliance through the Lutece tears. And much like a jazz band cover of a Tears for Fears song, it's an imitation that strives for success it doesn't understand nor rightfully deserve.